The scent of blood curled through the air like a whisper of temptation. Celine moved through the shadows, her footsteps soundless, her hunger a gnawing beast inside her. She had gone too long without feeding. Her body, once a temple of grace and power, felt like brittle glass, fragile, dangerously close to shattering. She clutched the infant to her chest, her silken black cloak wrapped tightly around him. His tiny whimpers scraped against her ears, a cruel reminder of her failure. He was starving, just as she was. But in this ruined city where mortals cowered behind locked doors and moonlight bathed the streets in silver, she had no choice. Tonight, she would feed, or she would perish. A dying nobleman lay crumpled against a shattered wall, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak but steady enough. Celine's sharp nails traced the edge of his throat, feeling the warmth, the promise of life beneath his skin. A single bite, a single drop, and she would be strong again, strong enough to protect her child. She leaned in, lips parting. Then the scent changed. Thicker, wilder, a force of nature, primal and unrelenting. A werewolf. Celine froze, her fingers tightening around her child. Before she could move, a deep growl rolled through the night, a sound that commanded obedience, dominated the darkness. He stepped into the dim light, broad and towering, his golden eyes glowing with something dangerous. Not just fury, something deeper, something raw. Ronan. He did not snarl like the others of his kind. He did not rush forward with claws bared. No, he stalked toward her, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment, as if he already owned her. Celine straightened, her lips curving into a dark smile, despite the pounding of her starving heart. "Come to kill me, wolf," she purred, her voice smooth as velvet, laced with poison. Ronan stopped mere inches from her, so close that the heat of his body brushed against her frozen skin. He was massive, muscles carved from war, every inch of him screaming strength and dominance. A predator made of fire and blood, standing before a creature of ice and death. His golden gaze flickered to the baby in her arms, then back to her. "You reek of weakness, vampire." His voice was low, rough, deliciously dark. "And yet, you still think you can tempt me with that smile." Celine's breath hitched, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she tilted her head, letting the moonlight kiss her pale throat. A silent challenge, a wicked invitation. Ronan's jaw tightened. She could feel it now, the pull between them. It was unnatural. It was wrong. And yet, it was undeniable. A deadly attraction, like a moth to flame. Celine took a step back, her voice soft, but edged with defiance. "I do not beg for my life." Ronan's smirk was sharp, wolfish. "Good. I don't spare those who do." The world around them was silent, holding its breath. Then, in a blur of movement, Celine lunged, not to strike, but to flee. But Ronan was faster. He caught her wrist, spinning her into his arms. The air cracked with tension, with heat, with something neither of them could name. Her sharp nails dug into his skin, his breath fanned across her cheek, and for a moment, just a moment, the lines between enemy and something else blurred. Her heart hammered against his chest, his grip tightened, unyielding. Then, from the darkness, the sound of approaching footsteps. Celine's coven was coming. And Ronan knew then, she was his now, whether she admitted it or not. The night was thick with the scent of blood, of frost, of something darker. Her. Ronan had never met a creature like her before. The vampires he hunted were wicked, monstrous things, moving like ghosts in the dark. But Celine was different. She was death wrapped in silk, hunger made beautiful. Even now, as her scent lingered in the air, he could feel the imprint she had left on him, like a blade pressed against his throat, a danger he wanted to taste. But she was gone. She had left the child behind. Ronan stared down at the infant swaddled in black. Small, frail, helpless. It should have meant nothing to him. just another creature of the night to be snuffed out before it grew into a threat. And yet, when the child whimpered, his fingers twitched. A single sound, so fragile, so desperate. The instincts of a warrior told him to abandon it, but something deeper, something older, demanded he act. With a low growl, Ronan bent down, lifting the child into his arms. His hands, made for battle, cradled life instead. The baby stirred against his warmth, its tiny body molding against his chest, as if instinctively trusting the beast that held it. A mistake, perhaps, but one Ronan was willing to let slide. The moonlight draped him in silver as he moved, his steps silent, his gaze sharp. He knew she would return. She had to. A mother could not simply abandon her own. Not without a fight. And Ronan wanted that fight. Wanted her. Hours passed, but he never left the ruins. He waited, standing beneath the shattered archway of a forgotten temple, the infant resting against him, a predator waiting for his prey to return. Then, like a whisper on the wind, she came. Celine stepped from the darkness, her form draped in midnight, her eyes glowing with something almost unholy, a goddess of the damned, searching for what she had lost. Her gaze locked onto the child, then flicked to Ronan. A storm brewed in her expression. Anger, guilt, something more, something she did not want to name. "Give him to me," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but edged with warning. Ronan did not move, did not yield. Instead, he tilted his head, a slow smirk curving his lips. "You left him." Celine stiffened. "I came back." Not soon enough. She took a step forward, her fingers curling at her sides. Beautiful, dangerous, his opposite in every way, yet something about her made his blood burn. Ronan held the child closer, not as a threat, but as proof. Proof that she had run. Proof that he had chosen differently. Her fangs glinted in the moonlight, frustration rippling through her. "You think you have power over me, wolf," she whispered, her voice carrying a darkness that sent lesser men to their knees. Ronan only chuckled. "No, little vampire. But I know what you are." She stilled. "You're starving," he murmured. "Weak. I can hear your hunger." His golden eyes flickered to her lips, parted just enough for him to glimpse the sharp points of her teeth. Deadly. Alluring. She shivered, but not from the cold. "I don't need your pity," she hissed. "Good." He stepped closer, towering over her. Commanding. Dominant. "Because I don't offer it." Celine clenched her jaw, but the hunger betrayed her, the faintest tremor in her fingers as her body betrayed its need. She hated him for seeing it, hated him for knowing. And yet, she did not pull away. Ronan reached for her wrist, slow, deliberate. Not a threat, not a demand, a promise. "I should kill you," she whispered. He smirked. "Then why don't you?" The answer hung between them, unspoken. Because she couldn't. Because something stronger than hatred had started to take root. Because the beast had found something worth keeping. The night was a quiet predator, stretching its dark hands over the ruins of the forgotten city. The wind whispered through the broken archways, carrying the scent of death, of longing, of her. Ronan stood still, his golden eyes never leaving Celine as she hovered at the edge of the shadows. She was breathtaking in her torment, a phantom of the night, torn between instinct and regret. He could feel it, the war raging inside her. She wanted to run. She wanted to fight. But most of all, she wanted to take back what she had abandoned. The infant stirred in his arms, a small whimper breaking the silence. Celine flinched, her pale fingers curling at her sides. The sound unraveled her. Ronan watched the way she trembled, the way her hunger and her guilt battled for control. He had seen desperation before, on the battlefield, in the dying eyes of men who knew they had lost. But this was different. This was something deeper, something primal. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice softer than he expected. Ronan's grip on the child tightened. "And yet, here I am." Celine took a slow step forward, her gaze locked on the baby, her lips slightly parted as if tasting the distance between them. She was hauntingly beautiful, a creature carved from moonlight and sorrow, her hunger making her even more deadly. He should have feared her, but fear was the last thing he felt. "What do you want, Wolf?" she asked, voice smooth as silk, edged with something dark. Ronan tilted his head, watching her the way a predator watches something fragile, something worth breaking. "The real question is, what do you want, little vampire?" Celine exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her perfect features. "You have no right to him." "I have more right than you." His voice was low, rough, an unspoken challenge. "I didn't leave him behind." Her eyes flashed, a deadly spark of defiance. Good. He wanted her angry, wanted her to feel. "He's mine," she hissed, stepping closer, her hunger now palpable in the air between them. Ronan smirked, unshaken. "Then take him." She faltered, just for a second, just long enough for him to see the truth. She couldn't. Not like this. Not when her strength had withered, when her body trembled from lack of blood, when her control was slipping like sand through her fingers. Ronan took a slow step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. She was a vampire, a predator by nature. But next to him, she looked small, breakable. And he liked it. Celine's breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers grazing the underside of her chin. A bold, reckless touch. Her skin was cold, but he felt the sharp inhale of breath, the way her lips parted slightly beneath his calloused thumb. "You're starving," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble. Not a question, a truth. Celine shivered, but she did not move away. She couldn't. The beast inside Ronan growled its approval. He had fought many wars, taken many lives, but this was different. This was something dark, something forbidden, and gods help him. He wanted more of it. Her fangs glinted in the moonlight, sharp and deadly, her eyes flickering between his throat and his lips. "You think you understand me," she whispered, her voice almost dangerous. "But you don't." Ronan chuckled, his hand sliding lower, fingers tracing the line of her jaw before falling away. "I understand enough." Celine clenched her jaw, torn between fury and something she refused to name. The silence between them pulsed, heavy, unspoken things curling in the air like smoke. Then the baby stirred again, breaking the moment, reminding them of what truly bound them together. Celine swallowed hard, her mask slipping back into place. "Give him to me, Ronan." His name on her lips was a temptation, a sin. He should have let her take the child. He should have walked away. But instead, he smirked. "Not until you prove you deserve him." Celine's eyes burned with rage, and something else. And for the first time, she realized she was trapped. The night stretched endlessly, a canvas of black and silver. Cold winds howled through the ruins, but the air between them burned. Celine's breath was ragged, her hunger tightening like a vice around her ribs. She had faced death before, danced with it, kissed it upon blood-stained lips. But this was different. Ronan, the beast, the wolf, the unshaken mountain standing between her and what was hers. His golden eyes studied her, sharp as a blade, filled with something more than dominance, something dangerous. He held the child as if he had always belonged to him, one large, calloused hand resting over the infant's small form, steady, protective. It should have been unnatural. And yet, it wasn't. Celine's fingers curled at her sides, nails sharp, aching to strike. But she knew better. A fight with him would end in ruin. Not because she was weak. No, she would never allow herself to be weak. But because he would not hesitate. And something in her whispered that he would enjoy breaking her. The thought sent a violent shiver down her spine. "I don't have time for your games, Wolf," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Give him to me." Ronan smirked, slow, wicked. "And what do I get in return?" Celine stiffened. There it was. The price. The hunt, the unspoken hunger in his gaze. She should have expected it. Wolves did not simply give. They took. Her fangs ached with frustration. She hated this, hated the way her body trembled, how the hunger in her veins made her fragile. She despised looking weak before him. But more than that, she hated how his presence set fire to something inside her that had no name. Ronan took a slow step forward, his towering frame swallowing the space between them. She held her ground, refusing to move, though her body screamed for distance. "You can barely stand," he murmured, his deep voice curling through her like a ghostly touch. "You need blood." Her throat burned at the mere mention of it. His gaze flickered to her lips, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough to send her pulse hammering. Enough to make the fire in his eyes deepen. She swallowed hard, forcing steel into her spine. "What do you want?" Ronan's smirk widened, slow and knowing. "I want you to take what you need." Her breath caught. The meaning in his words twisted through her like dark silk, weaving shadows between them. Take what you need. Celine knew what he was offering. Knew it in the way his golden gaze burned into her. A werewolf's blood was potent, alive, wild. It could heal, strengthen, make her whole again. But it was also intimate, primal. An act that bound predator to predator in ways words could never undo. She shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "I won't." Ronan reached out, fingers grazing the curve of her jaw. It was a reckless, dangerous touch, one that dared her to run. "But you will," he murmured. Celine hated that he was right, hated that her body ached for it. The hunger was suffocating, stripping away her control, her walls, her carefully built defenses. She had always been the one who held the power, until now. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, fingers pressing against the solid heat of his chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, a promise of life beneath her touch. Ronan inhaled sharply, the moment thick with something neither of them wanted to name. She could still walk away, still fight against the pull. But then the child whimpered, a fragile sound that shattered her last thread of hesitation. With a low growl of defeat, Celine parted her lips and sank her fangs into him. The world exploded. His blood was fire, pure and untamed, roaring through her veins like a storm. Power, strength, heat. It consumed her, devoured her, dragged her under like a riptide. Ronan stiffened beneath her, a sharp inhale breaking the silence. But he did not push her away. He let her take. Let her drown in him. Her hands clenched against him, nails digging into his skin, her body shuddering as his warmth chased away the cold. Ronan smirked darkly, his voice nothing more than a rough whisper. "That's it, little vampire. Take what you need." Celine had tasted blood before, sweet, bitter, fleeting, intoxicating. But this was something else. Roman's blood was wild, burning like the heart of a storm. Untamed. Forbidden. It roared through her like wildfire, licking at the edges of her hunger, filling the emptiness inside her with something dangerously alive. Her fingers curled against his chest, her body trembling from the rush of it. Every heartbeat, every pulse of life, dragged her deeper into the abyss of sensation. Power. Heat. Him. Ronan didn't move, didn't resist. He stood still, his body rigid, his breath slow and deep, but his golden eyes burned. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something else, something darker, something that made the space between them shrink into nothing. Celine's fangs retracted as she pulled back, her lips painted with the crimson evidence of what had just passed between them. She exhaled sharply, feeling her strength return, her body vibrating with renewed life. But as soon as she looked up, she knew. Ronan was watching her differently now. His golden gaze had always been sharp, always filled with that raw dominance that made lesser creatures tremble. But now, there was hunger. A slow, consuming hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Celine swallowed, trying to find her footing, but the warmth of him was still beneath her fingers, his pulse still steady beneath her touch. She should have stepped back, should have put distance between them. But she didn't. Ronan tilted his head slightly, his smirk slow, knowing, satisfied. His voice was low, a deep growl wrapped in silk. The way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on her lips, made her shiver. Celine clenched her jaw, refusing to let him see how deeply his presence unsettled her. She had taken from him, stolen a part of his strength, but somehow she felt like the one who had lost. "I didn't ask for your blood," she murmured, her voice cold despite the fire in her veins. Ronan chuckled, a dark, velvety sound that sent a strange heat curling through her spine. "No," he said, stepping closer, his towering frame eclipsing the moonlight. "But you needed it, and I let you have it." Celine hated the way his words coiled around her, the way his scent, all earth and storm, made it hard to think. She lifted her chin, forcing her body to ignore the magnetic pull of him. "We're even," she said. Ronan's smirk deepened, slow and wicked. "You think that's how this works?" Something in his voice made her pulse quicken. Before she could step away, he moved. Fast, predatory. His fingers closed around her wrist, firm but not painful, heat seeping into her skin, a silent reminder of what had just passed between them. Celine went still, not out of fear, but because she wasn't sure what she would do if he took another step closer. The beast inside him rumbled beneath the surface, barely contained, his golden eyes flickering with something ancient, something possessive. "You took my blood," he murmured, his voice slow, deliberate. "That means something, little vampire." Celine's breath hitched, but she forced herself to smirk. "To you, maybe." Ronan's grip tightened, just enough to send a sharp thrill down her spine. "To you too," he countered, his voice dropping lower. "You just don't want to admit it." She hated how easily he saw through her, hated how the space between them felt too hot, too tight, too charged. But the moment shattered with the softest of sounds, the infant stirring in Ronan's arms. Celine's gaze dropped instantly, and for the first time since she had tasted him, she remembered why she was here. The child. Her son. She pulled her wrist free from his grip, ignoring the heat that lingered there. "This conversation is over," she said, stepping back. "Give him to me." Ronan studied her for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound of amusement. But something in his gaze had changed. Something dangerous. Without another word, he lifted the child and placed him carefully into her arms. A silent surrender. But the way his fingers brushed against hers. Asterisk, asterisk, a lingering, deliberate touch. Asterisk, asterisk, told her this wasn't over. Not even close. Celine held the child close, her fingers trembling as they brushed over his delicate features. He was warm, so fragile, so breakable, and yet she had almost left him behind. Almost. The shame clawed at her, cold and relentless, but she buried it beneath layers of steel. She had him now. That was all that mattered. But she wasn't alone. Ronan watched her, standing in the ruins like a sentinel of the night. His golden gaze flickered over her, unreadable, but she could feel the weight of it pressing against her skin. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "This doesn't change anything." Ronan's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. "It changes everything." Celine clenched her jaw. "You think because you gave me your blood, because you—" She hesitated, hating the words she had to say. "Because you saved him, that I owe you something." He tilted his head slightly, considering her, the way a predator considers prey. "I think," he murmured, voice rich and dangerous, "that you and I are bound now, whether you like it or not." Celine's pulse quickened. Bound. She refused to acknowledge how the word sent an uninvited thrill through her chest. She turned away, holding the child closer, but Ronan was behind her before she could take a single step. His presence was overwhelming. Heat and strength, the scent of earth and storm wrapping around her like invisible chains. "You're trembling," he said, low and rough. Celine scoffed, forcing herself to breathe. Don't flatter yourself, wolf. Ronan chuckled softly, but there was something deeper beneath the sound, something dark. You're strong, Celine, but even you have limits. She stiffened as he moved closer, close enough that the heat of him seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, close enough to feel the deep rise and fall of his breath. Her throat tightened. She had fought monsters, had been the monster. But Ronan, he was something else entirely. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate, fingers brushing a loose strand of silver blonde hair from her face. A simple touch, but it was anything but innocent. You needed me tonight, he murmured, his voice dangerously soft. And you'll need me again. Celine's breath hitched. He was right, and she hated it. She had barely survived this night, had nearly let the hunger devour her, nearly lost herself in the storm of desperation. She had taken from him, fed from him, felt his power thrumming through her like an intoxicating drug. And he had let her, without fear, without hesitation. Ronan's fingers drifted lower, tracing along the delicate line of her jaw before falling away. Not a claim, not yet, but a warning. Celine swallowed hard, forcing steel into her voice. You think this means something? He smirked. It does. She glared at him, willing herself to ignore the pull, the slow burn in her veins. I don't belong to you, wolf. Ronan chuckled, his golden eyes flashing. Not yet. Celine turned sharply, forcing herself to move away. She needed distance, space, anything to silence the war raging inside her. But as she stepped into the night, she heard his voice behind her, quiet but unshakable. You can run, Celine. His voice was deep, unhurried. Certain. But you'll come back. Celine moved through the forest like a ghost, the child cradled against her chest. The trees stretched endlessly, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, but she barely noticed. All she could hear was the distant echo of his voice. You can run, Celine, but you'll come back. Her jaw tightened, arrogant, overbearing, infuriating. And yet, his words clung to her like a brand, searing through her defenses, awakening something she refused to name. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny breath warm against her skin. He was safe now. That was all that mattered. But the wolf's scent still lingered on her, earth, storm, and something darker, something dangerous. Celine shook her head, pushing forward. She needed to put distance between them, needed to remind herself that she did not belong to him, no matter how intoxicating his presence had been. But deep down, she knew the truth. He would follow. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop him. He found her before dawn. Ronan stood at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes locked onto her, unrelenting. He hadn't shifted, hadn't needed to. His presence alone was enough to remind her that she was hunted. Celine didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She met his gaze with the cold fire of a vampire queen. You don't know when to let go, do you? She murmured. A slow, wicked smirk curled his lips. I don't let go of what's mine. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Mine. She exhaled sharply. I am not yours. Ronan took a step forward. She should have stepped back. She didn't. He tilted his head, studying her. You took my blood, Celine. His voice was deep, rough like gravel. You bear my scent. She forced a laugh, though it felt like glass in her throat. You think a single night means anything. Ronan's smirk faded. It means everything. The space between them burned. Celine's fingers curled against the child's blanket, desperate for an anchor. You saved him, she said, voice softer now. Why? Ronan held her gaze, unwavering. Because you couldn't. The truth hit like a dagger. Because you couldn't. She had always been strong, always been in control. But that night, she had been desperate, vulnerable, weak. And he had seen her, truly seen her. Celine clenched her jaw. That doesn't mean I owe you anything. Ronan exhaled slowly, a deep, rumbling sound. He took another step forward, and this time the air between them crackled. "No," he murmured, "but it means you're not alone." Celine inhaled sharply. Alone. She had spent centuries embracing solitude, finding power in isolation. But standing here, under the dying stars, with Ronan's golden gaze burning into her, she felt it. The emptiness. The hunger for something beyond blood. Something she had spent lifetimes pretending she didn't need. Ronan lifted his hand, slow, deliberate. His fingers grazed her cheek, his touch searing through the cold that had lived inside her for far too long. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. She hated him, wanted him, feared him. And the worst part, she didn't know which feeling would win. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and blood. The night was thick with tension, the stars hidden behind heavy clouds. Yet in the center of it all, Celine stood frozen, caught between danger and desire. Ronan was too close, too strong, too sure. His golden eyes smoldered, burning through her defenses like wildfire. He had hunted her down, not out of need, but because he refused to let her go. She should have hated him for it. Should have driven a blade into his heart and walked away. But she didn't, because the truth was as sharp as the hunger in her veins. She had never been hunted before. Not like this. Not by someone who looked at her as if he would burn the world just to keep her in his grasp. Ronan tilted his head slightly, studying her with that infuriating smirk. "You're still running," he murmured, voice dark velvet. Celine exhaled sharply. "And you're still chasing." A low, rumbling chuckle escaped him, vibrating through the space between them. "Because you haven't given me a reason to stop." His hand lifted, slow and deliberate, his fingers costing over her jawline. A touch that sent an unspoken warning. A claim not yet spoken aloud. Celine swallowed hard. "And if I never do?" Ronan's smirk deepened. "Then I'll chase you forever." The word sent a shiver down her spine. Not a threat. A promise. The baby stirred in her arms, a quiet reminder of the life she had almost abandoned. The weight of it, of everything, pressed into her chest like iron. She should leave, take the child, and disappear before she forgot who she was. But then Ronan moved. A single step, enough to close the distance. His heat wrapped around her, his presence sinking beneath her skin. His fingers trailed down her arm, slow, steady, sending sparks through her cold veins. Celine's breath hitched. It shouldn't feel this good. It shouldn't feel like anything. But it did. Ronan leaned in, his voice a quiet storm against her ear. "You can fight this all you want, little vampire." Celine's nails dug into her palm, desperate for control. "You think you don't belong to me." Ronan's lips barely brushed her skin, his breath hot against her throat. "Then why does your pulse race when I'm near?" She hated him for that. Hated him for knowing her body's betrayals better than she did. Celine willed herself to speak, to push him away, to break whatever spell had wrapped around them both. But then his hand curled around her wrist, and she knew that if she left now, she would never be free of him, because he was already in her blood, in her bones. The moment stretched, sharp and electric. A choice waited at the edge of it. Ronan's grip tightened just enough to make her breath hitch. "Decide, Celine." His voice was low, rough, commanding. "Fight me, or give in." The words ignited something deep inside her, something ancient, something wild. She could taste the battle on her tongue. But as she met his gaze, felt the weight of his claim before it was ever spoken, she realized something far more terrifying. She didn't want to fight him. Not anymore. And that, more than anything, was her undoing.